Welcome back to VATSIM 101, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about airspace. This video is mostly going to pertain to VFR flying in the United States. It's the airspace system that I am the most familiar with as an IRL GA pilot, so the way the airspace operates in your country may be a little bit different. Always make sure that you're reading up on the rules for your particular country. Airspace is one of the most complex things that pilots learn about early on in their flying career. We're going to go over the different types of airspace, what regulations they have, and how to navigate through them on the VATSIM network. There are two different types of airspace that you will be flying through on the VATSIM network: controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace. Controlled airspace is airspace that is under the direct control of ATC. If you're flying IFR, you will always be required to be in communication with air traffic control. ATC separation will be provided for all IFR flights. For VFR flying, whether or not you have to communicate with air traffic control depends on what class of airspace you are flying through. Uncontrolled airspace has no ATC services at all, whether it's for VFR or IFR flying. Not only will you not have any communication with air traffic control, uncontrolled airspace doesn't require any radio communication of any kind. So if you've ever flown into a smaller airport and you see somebody flying around the area and you're getting a little annoyed because they're not making their position reports, it's likely because they are not required to. I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves here, people on VATSIM don't communicate on the radio because they just don't feel like it. This chart behind me has all the different airspace classifications in the United States. Don't worry, we're going to go through every single one of them. But before I do, I just want to address the FAA for a second, because this came right out of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Why are the colors not matching what's on the sectional chart? Like, honestly, let's put together this really nice graphic that shows us all the airspace, and then none of them are the colors that they're supposed to be. The 6 different classifications of airspace in the United States are Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, and Golf. Foxtrot was on vacation when they made this chart up. Now, in this video, you're going to hear me say MSL and AGL, or mean sea level and above ground level. Mean sea level is the altitude above sea level, or as your altimeter is going to read on your airplane. AGL, or above ground level, is your height over the ground. So if you hear me say MSL or AGL, that's what those terms mean. The only uncontrolled airspace in the United States is Class Golf. Every other class is controlled airspace. Now, right off the bat, we're just going to go over Class Alpha. As a VFR pilot, you are not allowed to fly in Class Alpha airspace. That is exclusive to high altitude IFR flying. Class Bravo is going to be all of your major commercial airports around the country. JFK, Atlanta, Chicago O'Hare, Denver International, all of those large international commercial airports. On your sectional, Bravo airspace is depicted in blue. The airspace is going to be from the surface up to 10,000 feet above sea level. And when you're looking at it from the side, it looks like an upside down wedding cake, where it has 3 different tiers. As you get higher in altitude, the width of that airspace becomes wider. The width of Class Bravo airspace really depends on the specific airport, but typically the inner ring is going to be about 5 nautical miles wide, the middle ring is going to be about 10 nautical miles wide, and the upper ring is going to be about 20 nautical miles wide. It can extend up to 30 nautical miles. Again, it really just depends on the specific airport. When you're within 30 nautical miles of a Class Bravo airspace, you are required to have a Mode C transponder along with ADS-B out capability. You're going to see this ring on the sectional charts, and it's going to say Mode C ADS-B Vail. As a VFR pilot, you will need to obtain specific clearance in order to fly through Class Bravo airspace. Class Charlie airspace is going to be magenta on your sectional charts. This airspace starts at the surface and goes up to 4,000 feet above airport elevation. The inner ring of the airspace is 5 nautical miles wide. The outer ring is 10 nautical miles wide. That outer ring will start somewhere around 1,200 feet above field elevation, and then it's going to extend all the way up to the top around 4,000 feet above field elevation. Class Delta airspace is going to be depicted on the charts as a blue dashed circle. The airspace starts at the surface and ends at around 2,500 feet above field elevation. Class Echo airspace is any airspace that is not designated as Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, or Delta. It starts at 1,200 feet above ground level, although it does start at 700 feet in certain areas, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and it extends up to 18,000 feet above sea level. It also starts above flight level 600 or 60,000 feet. So that is one little fun fact about Class Echo airspace. When Class Alpha ends at flight level 600, Class Echo starts and goes all the way up to pretty much infinity. All IFR aircraft in Class Echo airspace are required to talk to air traffic control. VFR aircraft can talk to air traffic control if they choose to, but they are not required to. So if you're flying around IFR and an air traffic controller gives you a traffic advisory and they tell you that they are not communicating with that aircraft or they don't know what that aircraft is doing, you're very likely in Class Echo airspace and that plane is not talking to them. Class Golf airspace is the only type of airspace in the United States that is uncontrolled. Basically the Wild West of aviation. Listen, if you think I'm exaggerating, go fly in a Class Golf airspace in the United States and tell me I'm lying. Class Golf airspace starts at the surface and extends to 1,200 feet AGL or 14,500 feet MSL, whichever is lower. Now, Class Golf can start at 700 feet AGL when it's depicted on charts. There's going to be a sort of magenta fade around it on the sectional charts. In Class Golf airspace, there are no radio communications that are required. There are no air traffic controllers to talk to, and you don't even need to have a radio to fly in that airspace. So if you're flying at a small airport and you're getting annoyed that there's a plane out there that's not making radio calls, it's likely because they don't have to. Right here, we have the different weather requirements for VFR pilots. If these weather parameters are not met, you as a VFR pilot cannot legally fly. So I'll just kind of step out of the way here so you can see this. You can pause to read, but really what I want to talk about is cloud clearance, because depending on the type of airspace that you're in, there are different requirements. Now, the reason that as a VFR pilot, you are not allowed to fly through clouds, other than the fact you haven't gone through the specific training needed to fly through conditions like that, because you're not getting ATC separation in most cases, it can be dangerous if you're flying really close to or inside of a cloud where there could be another plane. So by remaining a certain distance away from the clouds, it greatly mitigates your chances of a mid-air collision. Now, Class Bravo airspace has the most lax cloud clearance requirements that are out there. As long as you're not flying directly through a cloud, you have proper separation from it. In Class Charlie, Delta, and Echo, there is a cloud clearance requirement known as the 152 rule. You have to be 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontal. The exception with Class Echo airspace is when you're at or above 10,000 feet MSL, where the spacing is a lot further, because at those altitudes, you're normally flying a lot faster than you would at lower altitudes. So it's 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile horizontal. With Class Golf airspace, the weather requirements are seemingly kind of all over the place. So again, I'll just kind of step back so you can see it. You can pause to read here, but the cloud clearance requirements and the visibility requirements depend on what your altitude is. Here we have the weather conditions for the different types of flying. So there's 2 different categories of VFR and 2 categories of IFR. And once more, I'll just step out of the way so you can see it. You can pause to read here. If the weather meets the VFR or marginal VFR conditions, you are legal to fly. If the weather is at IFR or low IFR, as a VFR pilot, you can't fly. Legally, a ceiling is either a broken or overcast cloud layer, or if the weather reports a vertical visibility. Each airspace is going to have its own entry requirements, which are certain types of communication with air traffic control, along with certain equipment on board your plane. So again, I'm going to step out of the screen here so you can see this little grid that I put together. You can pause to read here. With Class Bravo airspace, as we mentioned before, you need a specific ATC clearance in order to fly through it. The controller has to say that you are cleared through the Class Bravo airspace. If you do not hear that, you are not allowed to enter Class Bravo airspace. The equipment requirements is you need a 2-way radio and you need a transponder with altitude reporting, known as a Mode C transponder. For Class Charlie and Delta airspace, you don't need a specific ATC clearance to fly through them. The controller just has to acknowledge you. If you contact air traffic control to get into Class Charlie or Class Delta, if they respond with your call sign, you are then permitted to fly through that airspace. The equipment requirements for Class Charlie airspace are a 2-way radio and a transponder with altitude reporting, and for Class Delta, you are only required to have that 2-way radio. And that's mainly because Class Delta airspace are not normally radar environments, meaning that even if you do have a transponder on your plane, there's really no way for them to track it. Before we head over to the charts, I do just want to point out a couple of different types of airspace that you may see on there. Some of them, for the most part, don't really apply to VATSIM, while some of them sort of do. But just in case you're looking at the sectional chart and you start seeing things like restricted areas and military operating areas, we're just going to talk about what all that means. Prohibited areas are going to be preceded with a P on the sectional charts. That is airspace that you are not going to be allowed to fly through, and that is simulated on VATSIM. If you see a prohibited airspace, do not fly through it. Restricted areas are preceded with an R, VFR, and they can be hazardous to aircraft that are not participating in whatever activity is going on. If that restricted area is not active, or if you receive clearance from air traffic control, you are permitted to fly through that airspace. Warning areas are going to be preceded with a W, just like restricted areas. They can be hazardous to non-participating aircraft, but the difference between a restricted area and a warning area is that there is no government jurisdiction. You're mostly going to see that off the coast of the United States. Military operations areas are going to be where military aircraft are conducting training. I still think the coolest thing I saw when I interned at ZNY was a bunch of A-10s that were flying around an MOA, and you could tell that they were just practicing gun runs. It was like the sickest thing I ever saw. As a VFR pilot, you are permitted through a military operating area without any sort of clearance, but it is discouraged because the military is going to be training there. Alert areas are going to be preceded with an A on the charts, and in these areas, you're either going to see a high volume of pilot training or unusual aerial activity. For the most part, this isn't simulated in VATSIM, but they are still depicted on charts, so just in case you see an alert area, that's what it means. Terminal radar service areas, I have flown through in the real world. I have not tried to do that in VATSIM yet, so I'm not really sure if that is something that is simulated. You're going to see this around Class Delta airports, and it's going to look kind of like a Class Charlie airspace, but instead of being magenta, it's going to be in gray. For VFR pilots, it is voluntary participation, but it is highly encouraged because you're going to be provided separation just like you would in a Class Charlie airspace. Another thing we'll talk about briefly is VFR flight following. Flight following is only available in controlled airspace. This is a voluntary separation service that air traffic control can give to VFR pilots. And it really depends on whether or not the controller's workload permits it. So if that controller is dealing with a high level of traffic, there's a good chance they're not going to provide flight following for you, but on your average day, you're usually going to get it. I don't think I've ever been rejected flight following by a controller, but it is a possibility. Next, we'll take a look at the sectional charts and see what some of this airspace looks like. We have the airspace around the Kansas City International Airport. And on this chart, you can see several thick blue rings that are around the airport. This is going to be Class Bravo airspace. On the chart, you're going to see the altitude boundaries right here. In this ring, we have 80 over 30. This is the airspace boundary in hundreds of feet. The airspace is going to begin at 3,000 feet, and it's going to end at 8,000 feet. And if we come to the next ring over, we have 80 over 24. So in that area, the boundary begins at 2,400 feet and ends at 8,000 feet. Now, if we come off to the west a little bit here, you're going to see this magenta line that kind of arcs around the airspace. That is going to be the Mode C ADSB out veil. So right here, you can see it says Mode C and ADSB out, 30 nautical miles. So if you're within that 30 nautical mile ring, you are required to have a Mode C transponder with ADSB out capabilities, whether you're in Class Bravo airspace or not. Now, if we take a look around, you're going to see some of these magenta arcs around some of these airports. In these arcs is where Class Echo airspace is going to begin at 700 feet instead of 1,200 feet. Next, we have Wichita, Kansas, which is a Class Charlie airspace. And I know it's a little congested, but right here, you can see two thick magenta rings that surround the airport. The inner ring begins at the surface and ends at 5,300 feet. So you can kind of see it. I'll zoom in a little bit more, but it says 53 over SFC. The airspace begins at the surface and extends up to 5,300 feet. The outer ring begins at 2,700 feet and ends at 5,300 feet. Next, we have a Class Delta airspace. So you'll see this blue dashed line around the Grand Island Airport. And in this little box right here, you're going to see 43. Airspace begins at the surface and it ends at 4,300 feet. Next, we'll go over some of the special use airspace that we talked about earlier. Right here, we have an example of a warning area. You can see we have warning area 106 Alpha, 106 Bravo. So you're going to see all of these sort of blue lines, and they're going to have little blue like tick marks in them. So that's just denoting where the warning area is. On the real sectional charts, there is part of it that tells you what all this airspace is and what it means for that particular area. With these special use airspaces, a lot of it's not simulated on VATSIM, but just wanted to point them out to you so you know what they look like. And then next we have an alert area. This one is mainly around the McGuire Air Force Base. So you can see there's a red box that goes around it with those little tick marks. It's got alert area A220, and then it's got a caution heavy jets operating at 2,000 and 3,000 within 15 nautical miles of McGuire. And that's going to be mostly for military aircraft that are operating around the Air Force Base. This right here is an example of a Tersa around the Erie International Airport. So here you can see it's shaped just like a Class Charlie, but it's in gray rather than magenta. And you'll see the regular altitude boundaries, and then around the airport itself, you could see the blue dashed line with the 3,200-foot altitude boundary for the Class Delta. And right here is an example of a military operations area, so you can see it's got a red boundary with all the little tick marks on it, and it's designated as the Truman MOA. So there's 3 different sectors. You have the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, and this one, just like the alert area, looks like there is an Air Force base that is in there. And right here, we have an example of restricted airspace, which looks like there's an MOA that's incorporated in there. Man, I really struggled to find one that I could show you that wasn't like all bunched up in the middle of something, but this is an example of a couple of prohibited areas. These are like the ones that most people know. The prohibited area P56, which is over the White House, and the Washington Mall. So just an example of some of the special use airspace that is out there. And if you're ever coming up on airspace like this and you're not really sure how to handle it, you can always ask air traffic control. And if it's a type of airspace that they're simulating, they'll let you know how to navigate either through it or around it. Or if they're not simulating it, it's basically going to be like it doesn't exist. And that'll wrap up today's video, everybody. Now, the next time you take to the skies, you'll know exactly what airspace you're in and what you're supposed to do to stay compliant with the rules. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to pop them in the comment section down below. Thank you very much for tuning into today's video, and until next time, everybody, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.